Thank you, everybody, for coming to the College Football Betting with Aaron Torres YouTube channel. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead, click that subscribe button. It helps our channel grow. It helps our audience grow. I appreciate it more than you know, as we're talking college football on this channel year-round. Appreciate your support. Click that subscribe button. Tennessee, Alabama this year. The game is in Knoxville. First return game in Knoxville since, of course, the goalposts ended up in the river 2 years ago. Hendon Hooker, we all remember that game. This is an interesting one because it opened, I think, Alabama about 1.5. It got up to 3.5. We're recording here on Wednesday afternoon. It is now Alabama at 2.5. The over-under set at 56.5 in this game. When I look at this game, listen, from the Alabama side of things, everybody all week long has talked so much about Bama. We don't need to dive in and break down everything, but we know what's going on, and it isn't pretty over the last couple weeks. Really, since the first half of that Georgia game, it has not been pretty, right? You struggle to close out Georgia. That's obvious. Then you give up 40 to Vandy in a game where Vandy basically just ran the ball all over you. You could not get them off the field. And then even last week against South Carolina, and we've talked about it time and time again, but, South Carolina was in position to win that game. South Carolina outgains you. You struggle again to run the ball without Jalen Milroe. And this Alabama team right now is reeling. And so with Alabama, it's going to come down in Knoxville to two things. What does this offense look like? And, basically, can they get anything going outside of Jalen Milroe? Jalen Milroe has made some big passes, but the strength of this team, I'm tripping over my words here. The strength of this team has been with the ball in his hands, running the football. That is not sustainable over 12 weeks, 13 weeks, 14 weeks, 15 weeks in a college football playoff that is expanded. And even after that South Carolina game, you could see he was just worn down by the end. That South Carolina pass rush was able to get to Jalen Milroe. That has to be concerning going into this game against Tennessee. And then on the defensive side, you got to make plays and you got to make stops. The performance, just put simply, was not good enough last week against South Carolina, and the previous week against Vandy. Right now, they cannot get off the field. 54th ranked run defense in college football. They gave up 166 yards on the ground versus Vandy. South Carolina, 312 yards of total offense. But remember, in that game, South Carolina comes out in the second half, shoves the ball right down their throat, drives the length of the field, and it's just not good enough. It just isn't good enough. Needs to get better. And listen, DeBoer's talked about it all week. Kane Womack's talked about it all week. We get it. So there's some positives and a lot of negatives for Alabama. For Tennessee, it's tough, right? Because this is a program that has struggled so much over the last couple decades, that looks so good early. And so I think the Tennessee fan base was just ready to say, we're back. It's all figured out. We're amazing. We're in that national title hunt. We're one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the country. And obviously the last 2 weeks have been humbling. You lose to Arkansas. Last week, you struggle to put away Florida. You win in overtime. And I think what's interesting about Tennessee, like everybody else, there's some positives, there's some negatives. I think the negatives are so apparent that they're overshadowing the positives a little bit, in my opinion, in the case of this team. With the positives with Tennessee, the positives are pretty straightforward. Even as certain areas of the team have struggled, the run game has remained awesome. And Dylan Sampson, I'll tell you this, people talk about, is Travis Hunter the Heisman favorite? Is Ashton Genty the Heisman favorite? Who is really in the Heisman conversation? If you're having a Heisman conversation without Dylan Sampson, you are a casual. There's nothing else to say other than that. 699 yards rushing, 15 rushing TDs, 112 yards, 3 rushing touchdowns last week. And Tennessee has now played 6 games this season. Dylan Sampson has 5 100-yard rushing games. The only game he didn't was against that elite Oklahoma defense, where he, quote-unquote, only had 92 yards rushing. So he has been awesome. The Tennessee defense remains elite. Even as the offense has been kind of hit or miss, especially in the past game. We'll talk about it in a minute. Tennessee, number 2 in the country in total defense. And in terms of scoring defense, top 5 nationally, giving up less than 11 points per game. Of course, with the good comes the bad. And right now, Nico Imamaliava he's not playing great football. And it's not a knock, and I'm not here to criticize. He's not the worst player that's ever existed, but he's not playing very well. And it's funny because I go back to some of my own commentary, kind of dating back to, when you're beating teams really bad. You beat NC State, you beat Oklahoma in a game that you dominate. And it's a weird deal because I go back in that time in my head and I said, oh, Heupel's really taking the foot off with Nico. There's another level for this team to go to when Heupel takes off the kid gloves. Well, now maybe there's a reason that hasn't taken off the kid gloves, because he clearly does not trust this guy. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's a fact. Nico's only thrown for about 1,300 yards this year. Nico has not thrown for more than 200 yards since week 2 against NC State. That's kind of a mind-boggling stat in any offense, let alone this one. Now, the Kent State game, he was obviously pulled early, but 194 yards against Oklahoma. I think that was the peak of like, you know what? We're not going to put too much on his plate, whatever. But then after that, 158 yards in the loss to Arkansas, 169 yards last week to Florida, 61% completion percentage against Florida, 59% completion percentage against Arkansas, 62% completion percentage against the Oklahoma Sooners. So it's clear that Heupel wants to rely on the run game. It's clear that Heupel wants to rely on the defense. So let's get to the pick and the best bet in this game. And I'll be honest, the best bet in this game feels very obvious to me. And it's the under 56.5. Okay. And we're going to I'll give you my thought on who's going to win the game, who isn't going to win the game in a second. But when I think about this game, first of all, there's some interesting stats. Vegas, just for whatever reason, knock on wood, because I could look dumb come Monday for saying this. I think Vegas still sees Tennessee as that team that's putting up 60, 65, 70 a game like they were week 1, week 2, week 3. Last couple weeks since SEC play started, though, I don't think people realize, what this team, really has done as far as they're not even close to hitting the over in these games. Okay, the over-under in the Oklahoma game was 56.5. The game ends up at a total of 40 in that game, and that was after Oklahoma scored a bunch of points late. The Arkansas game was over-under of 60.5. That was my best bet that week. It ends up being 19-14, so 31 points in the game, a 29-point differential in the over-under. And then the Florida game last week, the over-under was 56. It got to 40 with overtime. So I just bring it up because these numbers aren't even close, but I also just look at how I think this game is going to be played. And there's a couple of obvious things to me. First off, Tennessee, as we said, they want to run the football. I don't think Josh Heupel, even in a perfect world, wants to let Nico loose unless he absolutely has to. So if you can run the ball against an Alabama defense that has struggled to stop the run, you just keep doing that. But Alabama, they've had trouble getting off the field. They haven't necessarily, they're not giving up a million explosive 30, 40, 50-yard runs. They can't get plays in the backfield. And so when I look at the Tennessee side of things, I think Alabama wants, Alabama is going to try to keep the ball. Like the point I'm trying to make, they want to limit explosive plays. I think Tennessee is just fine doing exactly what South Carolina and Vandy have done over the last couple of weeks, which is run the ball right at Alabama. Conversely, when Alabama has the ball, what have they struggled with the last couple of weeks? Listen, I love Jalen Milroe. They're putting too much on his plate right now. And I said it last week. You take Ryan Williams out of the mix, they have a lot of trouble making big plays. And so increasingly, as the season has gone on, it's become more and more put the ball in Jalen Milroe's hands and hope for the best. And so in this game, I don't think there's going to be a lot of big passing plays. But beyond that, think about this. Think about how much the pass rush gave Alabama fits last week against South Carolina. Kyle Kennard was unbelievable. Dylan Stewart was unbelievable. Well, who's Tennessee's best player? James freaking Pierce, potential number 1 pick of the draft, off the edge. And Alabama's O-line, people sit there and say, they're struggling to block. They're too big. A couple of them are closing in on 400 pounds. Whatever the reason is, they're not pass protecting well. They're not run blocking. They're not playing very well right now. Yep. So I could go on and on. But when I look at this game, it feels obvious to me. Tennessee is going to want to run the ball. I think they're going to be effective running the ball. And then I think that the pass rush is going to get to Jalen Milroe, and it's going to disrupt the pass game. The same game plan that South Carolina was able to implement, I think Tennessee is going to be able to do something similar, especially at home, as opposed to South Carolina playing on the road. So my best bet is the under. This game to me has like 24-21 written all over it. But 24-21 written all over it. If I had to make a guess, if I had to make a prediction on the final score, I'd take Tennessee to win. I'd take Tennessee plus the points. I don't believe in this Alabama team. I still like Kalen DeBoer. This isn't like Torres turning on Kalen DeBoer. I just have big time questions about this Alabama team. Now you got to go on the road. I mean, they went on the road to Vandy and lost, struggled at home against South Carolina. You're going into Knoxville, freaking Tennessee as a favorite. I was kind of surprised by this line. I think it's low scoring. My best bet is officially the under.